Today I'm speaking with Shane Almgren. Shane, thank you so much for joining me today.
Happy to be here, Tim. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And I just want to start off. I was just watching your interview with Derek Bennett. I'll have the link beneath this video for that. Derek Bennett is obviously a great guy. He's a friend of mine. You two have been friends for a while, and your interview with him was amazing. I want to make sure I don't forget to plug that. Thank you all for that video, and thank you for the humor. You all are just an absolute hoot when you all get together. So I loved seeing that. So
We
shout out.
are we require adult supervision when we get together. Yes.
Agreed. So shout out to Derek Bennett. Just to go into a quick bio here, Shane is originally from Texas, but he currently lives in Nashville, Tennessee. He's the
hmm
founder and chief creative ninja at his podcast called Live to Create, which he did before. He's taken a little break and he's going to be starting it up again. I'll have the link for that beneath the video. He's also the owner, founder, and executive creative director at Shane Almgren Multimedia and Entertainment, which is a boutique design company. They do all kinds of things. If you want to fill us in a minute about that. He's also the author of two books, at least so far. One of them is called Conspiracy Christianity, the 7 Evangelical Training Principles that Promote Wild Propaganda, Dangerous Misinformation, and Outlandish Conspiracy Theories. The other book is called The Trumpland Diary, a journal of bigly proportions. And that's an interesting point to make that you did work for Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago.
Yep,
Uh,
I did.
Shane grew up in a fundamentalist, evangelical, charismatic Christian home. He was the son of a missionary and a preacher. He's also himself a former worship leader and was a missionary in Asia. He studied at Palm Beach Atlantic University, focusing on journalism and psychology. And that's what I know about you so far. So tell us more about yourself and maybe if any of your hobbies.
Really, that's everything there is. If someone could read that into my eulogy, we wouldn't need to say anything else. Yeah.
Nice, nice. Tell us one of your hobbies or something fun about yourself.
Well, I came to Nashville for music. I've been a musician. I started piano when I was 4, I think, and haven't ever stopped. So I came here for music, was in the music industry full time for about 10 years and transitioned out of that into the design world. We still do some music, but um, that's probably the main hobby. It's writing, and if it's not writing words, then it is writing and recording music.
Hmm, that's awesome.
So,
I love it. I feel like since I've deconverted, the creative part of me, for whatever reason, even though I probably was somewhat creative before, it just feels like it's exploding. And I love meeting people that do that for a living. It's awesome. It's definitely in my heart too. Well, I would love at this point to pass the ball to you to kind of hear your story. I do want to, at some point get to your books, but at this point, we'll start first with your story. Just, how did your Christian worldview shape and how did your story evolve?
so my parents were products of the 1970s Jesus movement. They did not come from religious backgrounds. They met at a Shepherd's Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas, where I was conceived. And they were young. I think my mom was 18, my dad was 21. They got out of the Air Force and went straight into Christ for the Nations Bible Institute in Dallas.
Interesting.
So that's where like my first couple years on the planet, that's where I grew up, was, in the aisles for the worship ceremonies at Christ for the Nations. So, the
Hmm.
people dancing in the aisle, the tambourines. I think, I was 2 years old and I loved my tambourine. They had, tell stories of me running up and down the aisle, shaking the tambourine. So for me, it was as much a part of everyday life, as going out with shoes on, or, you brush your teeth before bed, you get 3 meals a day, you go to chapel, you go do the whole worship experience. And, once we got out of that, moved a couple hours north of Wichita Falls, Texas, I joked that if the church doors were unlocked, we were there. So we were like the Sunday morning, Sunday night, Tuesday was like a cell group at someone's house. Wednesday night, there was the Royal Rangers, which is like the Assemblies of God equivalent of the Boy Scouts.
So it's like
Friday
in your
night.
blood.
Oh yeah. I mean, we would have broken in, except my mom had a strict like 7:30 bedtime. We would have just gone and sat in the church at midnight on Monday just so we didn't miss a day.
Hmm.
So we were the opposite of Christmas and Easter Christians. We were there. We just, yeah, eat, breathe, lived it.
Hmm.
Um,
Did you, I'm just curious with the charismatic side of it, did you feel like there was a strong sense of the actual, like, even from a young, maybe not 2 years old, but as a young child growing up in that, did you eventually feel like you were actually becoming part of it and like feeling the spirit moving, and like how and when did the intensity of it all start for you?
That's a great question. And looking back, I wonder, because some of the deconversion stories that I hear are people who were not as heavily immersed in it as I was. They either came to it later in life, like they had their conversion experience, which I never got. Um, so the deconversion was a rough process. It was a lengthy process because it wasn't reverting back to something that I came from. It was going to a whole new thing that was just completely outside my paradigm.
Mm,
Um, and there wasn't anyone to go to discuss it. The people I tried to weren't having any of it. So it was like, it was something I had to go through on my own. But growing up that way, you don't really have a contrast to point to. Go, okay, so that's how back when you were living your life in the flesh without the Lord, whatever, this is what it was like. And then, but once you come over to the good side, and here and you see the difference, and so you can kind of go, yeah, okay, I see the difference. There's just, you need a second thing to have comparison, and I didn't
yeah,
have a second thing. And so when you don't have that experiential comparison to draw a contrast between, you rely on your elders. I had to rely on my parents and my youth group teachers and my Christian teachers at school and the pastors and the Sunday school teachers to tell me what I was experiencing, which is just what they thought that I should be. Um, and one of the things that, looking back, I go, it's the most pronounced. It's when people told me how I felt about a thing. And when we talk about a lot of just the Bible stories, the theology of it, people start getting so often they get bogged down in, is this true? Are these things true? Was this historically true? Did this actually happen? Did he actually walk the earth? The mythicist debate is a big thing. And it's like 99% of the debate is over, is this true? And not, is this good? Like, and people go, well, I go, I don't really care if it's true or not. The point is, like, the truth of it, I don't think it is true, but if it was, it's horrifying. The implications of not just the overarching theology and doctrine being true, but the individual, like the vignettes, the different stories along the way. We go, that's horrifying if that actually is true. Like, the thing that helps me sleep is knowing it's not true. But all throughout your upbringing, people going, that's beautiful, that's beautiful, that's beautiful. And they don't ever stop long enough for you to collect your own thoughts. You just start parroting what they say. Yeah, this is the greatest story ever told. This story is beautiful. God's love for mankind, that he sacrificed his only son, is beautiful. And then when you finally turn off the noise and go, everybody shut up, let me think about what I think about, and you go, no, this is not beautiful, this is horrific. um so growing up, obviously, when because I didn't deconvert or start the process until my mid-20s. So from the time I popped out until I came to Nashville, I was just constant echo chamber of people telling me what I felt, how I felt about it, um, that I was feeling it wrong if I ever vocalized some line of thinking that wasn't in line with the accepted platform. No, you understood that wrong. Reshape your thought. You commit a whole lot of thought crimes.
yeah.
Um,
Well, can I ask, what was the actual time though when you would have said, even if it wasn't a night and day conversion, what was the time at which you said either I'm placing my faith in Christ now, or at least acknowledging at some point I must have done it because I currently believe it, but I'm gonna like make sure and rededicate it and just at least profess it or get baptized. Like, when did you look back and say, I definitely placed my flag in the sand and said, this is my faith too?
it was So I want to say, in the evangelical, your salvation is not from being baptized. Like it's not the Catholic sprinkling, whatever. It's a conscientious choice. So your parents are kind of hammering it into you so that I don't know. I want to say I was like 3 or 4 when I first, invited Jesus to come live into my heart. And it's a young enough age where I would go around and tell my friends I opened my mouth and Jesus flew in down and now he lives in my heart. So that's like the evolution of my thought process at the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. If he's in
I
your heart, he's got to get there somehow.
Yeah, he's got to get there somehow. And one of the things about me, I've had OCD pretty strongly, obsessive compulsive disorder. And for some people, it's did I leave the stove on? Did I leave the stove on? Did I lock the door? And you've got to get up and 12 times in the night to check to see if the stove is. And even you've checked 11 times and it's off, but you're compelled to go look again. Salvation like that, it was like that for me. And so I was like, okay, I know I invited Jesus in, but what if I didn't? And
oh yes,
so I think I must have gotten saved or accepted and it wasn't like from the age of 4 to 6. It was like from 4 to college.
yeah.
Like
Well,
I
there's
mean,
so
I
much at stake. You
remember.
have to.
Yeah, I went to a Baptist affiliated Palm Beach Atlantic is a Baptist affiliated school. And so Tuesdays was mandatory chapel, and I probably got saved in chapel a couple dozen times in my collegiate career. So I was like layers upon layers of saved. Um,
Mm.
so I didn't have, it's like it's not scraping off one layer of wallpaper. It's when somebody's wallpapered a 200-year-old house several dozen times, and you got to take off dozens and dozens of layers of it to finally figure out what were the walls like under there before we started plastering all over them.
Yeah.
Uh,
It seems like too, there's a sense of as you grow in your knowledge of the Bible and theology, that you look back on your earlier days in it and making a profession in a very simplistic sense. And yes, the Bible does say things like, have faith as a child. But at the same time, as you grow in your theology, you realize I didn't really understand the depths of the doctrines of grace. And when you
mhm.
start, like for me and a lot of other people, it was Calvinism. But when you start to really dive into what has God been up to, and you realize you were ignorant of that when you said, that you did want to accept God's free gift. But now that you understand so much more about what he was doing and what salvation's about, you're like, was my understanding about it enough? Like, because I was understanding so little. And it feels like too, when you put that dynamic in the context of if you are wrong on this, like there's literally hell to pay. It's so scary. And I know I got under the lordship salvation message, which is the idea that if Christ is truly in you and the Spirit is truly the one that's doing this great work, he's not going to leave you enjoying your sin. He's going to convict you of your sin. So you need to be holy, not to be saved, but just, holiness is going to naturally come. But because you sometimes question, am I holy enough? Am I convicted of sin enough? You're like, well, maybe the fruit of the Spirit isn't actually there because it's kind of shifty some days. And it all adds up to like a spiritual OCD, like you're saying. And it's like back and forth. Am I saved? I think I am, but maybe I'm not. And it's kind of scary to think about how much psychological damage that puts on us as young people.
And I didn't really fully comprehend the psychological damage in like I don't feel like I experienced trauma. Like I don't feel like I need therapy. I don't need to get it off my chest. But looking back, if I had seen objectively, like as a third party, some person doing this to the kid, I would feel compelled to intervene and be like, dude, what you're doing is borderline psychological abuse.
Yes.
Because I remember one of the things my parents were really big on, you show your love by, well, what was it? Spare the rod, spoil the child. And so, I mean, I was spanked constantly. Um, but I remember when I was about 5, my grandmother had cancer, and I was, the way we were brought up, you pray for anything. Anything you ask in Jesus' name will be done. And so there was no question that Jesus was going to heal her. I was, faith like a child. It was, my mom, it was her mother. She was obviously concerned. I got no concerns. I'm going to pray for grandma. Grandma is going to be perfectly fine. She ended up succumbing to the cancer in not very long of a period of time. And I couldn't make sense of it because it was like, here's what the Bible says. Anything you ask in my name will be done. Well, I did ask in Jesus' name over and over and over. I didn't understand it. And the explanation that my parents gave was that God doesn't answer prayers if we have sin in our lives. And the way there's probably, we had lots of kids' books that all these different concepts were illustrated. And the concept of sin, it kind of looked like that pig pen dust cloud. It was just like this ball of dark brown, whatever, that just kind of followed you around. But it also talked about how the concept of sin wasn't pure evil. It was just missing the mark. And I think getting older, it's an old archery term that literally means to miss the mark. So it's an imperfection. So if you were to aim at a target and you just hit like on the edge of the bullseye, that's still a sin. And you go, okay, well, it's not not a bullseye in sin. There's sort of a discrepancy in the way that they're taught. And it would have been a much easier on a little kid to teach them that, not being perfect can be sin. But when you go, just anything you do that isn't right is a sin. And so God won't hear you. If I had to trace my OCD back, I think that was the start of it, because I became like fanatical about cleaning, because I thought, oh, my drawers aren't organized, my closet's not organized. I had toys that weren't picked up. That's why grandma died, is because I wasn't perfectly cleaning everything. And it got to the point, I mean, it was so bad. Like, I remember, I think it was my 10th birthday. I had a sleepover, I had like a dozen kids from my T-ball team or little league team. And I had bunk beds in my room. I literally had all of the guys with their sleeping bags on the bunk beds. And I was vacuuming my room during my birthday party because there was like lint on the floor. And it was that level of OCD. I have to clean this lint up so that my cleanliness is perfect. So if another family member gets cancer and I pray for them, then God will answer at that time.
Wow.
So I don't know for sure that that's where the OCD came from, but I can't detect it prior to that.
Wow. That's incredible. The pressure and, like you called it, the psychological child abuse. It's nuts. It's crazy that we can do this to our kids and not see it. It's really crazy. So when you were going through this kind of thought process as a child, were you able to ever articulate it to your parents and you kind of express the anxiety that was going on in your heart, even at that age?
No, we have and this is what's weird is, my parents were the kind of people that would always, they would have the conversations frequently. Like, now, that you can come to us at any time, anything that's going on. We want to be the first people that you come. We don't want you to have to go through things. But my sister and I both learned early on that there was so much negative feedback from saying, like, there were some topics you just didn't discuss. And my parents' reaction to just about everything was a spanking, and like severe ones. What would probably be considered physical abuse today. And it'd certainly be called aggravated assault if you did it to another adult. And so they verbally told us that we're in an environment where you can talk freely, while demonstrating you are absolutely not. And actions speak louder than words. And we learn to just ignore what they're saying, watch what they're doing, and understand we do not live in this free speech does not apply in a Christian household.
Yeah, for sure.
And there were, like, I remember another event that had a profound impact on how much I trust. Like, I knew my parents God placed them there because they told me that. But one of the things that we did every night as a family is we had family devotions. So my mom, dad, me, and my sister, we'd gather on either one of our beds, one of the parents would read a Bible story, and then everyone would go around the circle and say what they got out of the story, and then we do like group prayer. So we go around the circle, everybody says their nightly prayer. And we'd read the story of Abraham and Isaac one night, and my sister leave my room. My dad is tucking me in. Again, I'm probably 5 years old, and I said, "Daddy, what would you do if God asked you to sacrifice me?" And he said, "Well, son, I wouldn't like it at all, but if the Lord asked me to, I wouldn't have any choice but to obey." And for years, I was terrified that God was going to ask my dad to sacrifice me. And so I would, like, as soon as my parents would leave the room, I would get up and like build like Swiss Family Robinson style booby traps. I had rolls of old Christmas wrapping paper, and I'd like pyramid them up. So if the door opened, because my dad was coming in to sacrifice me, I'd have like a warning. I don't know where I was going to go because there wasn't like a second door, and this was a second floor of an apartment. But it was a warning in case Dad was divinely commanded to sacrifice me, which is in hindsight, that's a fucked up thing for a 5-year-old to be dealing with. Is I hope Dad doesn't come kill me tonight.
Mm, that's insane. That just that whole dynamic it's truly just insane. The idea of being able to tell your kids those stories with a straight face and say, like you started with, this is a good story. This is a good thing. I remember my own wife, she's a conservative Christian. She told the kids a few years ago, like right to their faces, that story of if your child is disobedient, pick up stones to stone them to death. She
Mm-hmm.
was like, if you're disobedient enough, if it was back in the Old Testament times, I would have absolutely picked up a stone and been the first one to stone you. And it's just like, oh my gosh, that was as I was deconverting, and it just broke my heart to hear those words. And it's like you want to think better of these adults that are saying this, but you're like, can you not hear yourself? Can you not hear what you're saying? You are literally abusing children this minute by what's coming out of your mouth. There's just like, this is the word of the Lord. This is good stuff. It has to be. You have to bow your knee. And it just, oh, it's crushing. It's absolutely crushing to see it. And to think, even though you and I have escaped, for all the people that have escaped, there's how many, hundreds of thousands of kids that are growing up in it still that have just started this journey. They're just getting this training, and it's going to go on for years. It's crushing. It's really crushing.
It was something. And then, um, so I guess I was about 10. We got the word from the Lord that we were going to China. So we moved to China as missionaries, spent a couple years there, spent time
Wow.
in Hong Kong, Thailand, and Malaysia.
Hmm. Did you learn any of the languages yourself?
Yeah, so Mandarin, I was fluent in Mandarin. My mother stuck us in a Chinese school as soon as we got there.
Wow.
So there
Talk about
was,
culture shock.
yeah, that was huge culture shock going from Texas, Wichita Falls, Texas, to this has nothing to do with Christianity, but our whole family, we had really, really twangy accents, and my parents were both English teachers. You can't go into China as a missionary. So there's a company in Tulsa, Oklahoma called University Language Services, ULS, and they would place missionaries in China as English teachers. That's the official role as far as the Chinese government is concerned. You do your missions work on the down low, hush hush.
Right.
So my dad was an English teacher in the college. My mom was an English teacher in the high school. And because we came from Texas, you had all these Chinese people walking around speaking broken English in this heavy, heavy twang accent. I mean, it sounded like the Dukes of Hazzard taught them how to speak English. It was kind of funny. Not related
That's
to
funny.
Jesus Christ at all, but
Yeah. It's interesting. I grew up hearing those stories. A lot of people that would have to be real careful in countries like that about how they would come in, like what's their profession while they're there, and that's interesting. And I I can't imagine like how it's changed. I honestly just I have not been privy to the cultural shifts in that arena, but I would imagine it's even more scary today because of the different political dynamics that you could go in and if they suspect you're doing something either against their religious policies or even harder if they're actually going to accuse you potentially of doing something for the US government, even if it's not true, that, you could end up in prison for I would imagine a long time. It's got to be pretty scary to do that. And I know people still do it though, obviously for the sake of the kingdom.
Well, we saw some things. I don't know how into the weeds you want to get on, because the next book I've got coming out it's directly related to this story. But so anyways,
Yeah, go for
everybody
it.
that goes there, that gets sent in with ULS is stationed at a college. And we were stationed at the National University of Defense Technology in Changsha, South Central Hunan province. And it was one of the communist government's top military schools. So it's where they did like their bioweapons research. And so most of the school campuses were, they're freely, you're walking along and now you're on the school campus. And now if the dorms, they kind of all look alike. You could be on a campus and not realize that you've walked onto a campus. The Chinese name for our school was Guafeng Kada. You could not get on into Guafeng Kada because it had like 12-foot cement walls all the way around that were covered in glass at the top. There were guarded checkpoints. I think there were like 3 entrances to this. It was a massive sprawling campus. It's about 65 acres. There's 3 ways in, checkpoints with guards with machine guns, and then the foreign compound was further walled off with its own guard set inside the campus. And so my sister and I would walk to school. We're passing 3-4-star generals, people with machine guns all the time, to go in. Of all the places to have to do undercover missionary work, you could not conceive, on paper, you could not come up with a worse location. And the way we eventually found out that all of the foreign apartments were bugged is, and so here's how the missionary part of it would work. Is my parents would go, they teach their classes. Afterwards, their students would hang around trying to practice their English. And in between classes, my parents were taught to say, on Sunday, there's this little park down the road. They call it English Corner. Why don't you come out on Sunday morning? And that's where all the missionaries would gather and we'll all practice English together. And so in lieu of church, what they do is all the missionaries would show up there and they'd start off, it'd be English practice, and then they kind of segue into the proselytizing. And that's where people would get saved. And so we'd all meet at this public park. And after they built up a sizable following, then they started having like Tuesday or Thursday night cell groups back in our apartment, where the students who live on the campus have to pass through the guard center and sign in, to get here. And so I guess the Chinese officials that after a while had, why are dozens of students showing up every Tuesday or Thursday night? And my dad came home at lunch from class one day, about 6 months into our tenure there, and he said, half of my students weren't in the room today, and nobody really knows what happened, but some of their dorm mates just said a bunch of the armed guards came into the dorm and hauled them out in the middle of the night. And we got up, their parents, a lot of these people, their families had also been taken, members of their family. So the students that were still left were talking with some of the family members of the students who were missing, found out that the family members were missing, and they didn't get returned. They vanished. They were never seen or heard from again. So we don't know if they were killed or if they were like put in some kind of gulag or what happened. But like the reality of what could happen to you for doing this, it was very real. The school, they kicked us out. They weren't going to arrest us because it would have, saving face is a big thing with the Communist Party. And to say that, some non-spies, this little family from Wichita Falls, infiltrated our bioweapons school and were conducting Christian things right under our noses for months with us oblivious, that was a huge embarrassment. So they'd rather just kick us out and, not talk about it. But we did find another school to land with. And I think we were there for another year until the Tiananmen Square massacre happened, at which point we were all of us, all the Westerners in the country were kind of kicked out at that point. But the danger of it was it wasn't theoretical, it wasn't hypothetical, it wasn't like a whispered story you tell to, keep people in line and keep your children behaving. Like we saw it. We watched, 3-4 dozen people just disappear.
Yeah. So crazy. It's heartbreaking. Glad you all were able to be safe through that, but it's hope the best for those people that were taken. When you were looking at that life that they were living, they were choosing to be missionaries. Were you getting any sense that this was both an expectation for you to join in on that, and also, even if it wasn't pressure from them, just a sense of this is like the highest calling? And I know, like, for me, I had the pressure, like the highest calling was to be a preacher or missionary. Like you could go, mop floors somewhere, flip burgers or whatever, or even be an engineer or something really, that took a lot of education, but it's still not the highest calling. The highest is to expound the word of God or to share the gospel. Did you have that kind of pressure on you at all?
It wasn't conscientious pressure, but it's when people put pressure on you sort of indirectly. They're not intending to, but they're putting stuff in front of you that creates pressure.
Yeah.
So I remember, and a lot of it was once you get into the circle of missionaries, like the stories, the books that get passed back and forth, the music, well, at the time it was cassette tapes. If there's any VHS recordings of teachings or preaching segments, whatever, there's this very concentrated, I don't want to say it's like celebrity culture, but like I remember Jim Elliot was one of the people back from the 80s, and he was a missionary that was sent to Ecuador, and he was contacting one of these uncontacted tribes that were, they were murderous, cannibalistic, and I think the deal was he ended up in a stew. And so if you're a Christian missionary, Jim Elliot is like, I don't know, like the way that the reverence reserved for him is kind of like the way like Elon Musk is for tech fanboys now. It's like that's not only was he doing the missionary work is like a level 9. The only way you can get to level 10 is to get killed in the line of duty. It's in the military, it's that's where you get your medal of valor or whatever. It's not just going, it's you get wounded, you pull somebody out, you make the ultimate sacrifice. And so that was the people who died on the mission field. That was seen as the apex level to get. There's not a higher level than that.
Yeah, I felt that same pressure a lot, and I felt like it was in many ways it was saying, like, look, God clearly calls us to suffer and to be willing to die for the sake of sharing the gospel. We're living this cushy life here in America, but just because we can live a cushy life and avoid that fear of being persecuted severely or dying for Christ doesn't mean that we should. And perhaps, like, we should be flipping our perspective and saying, like, God, I want to. I remember this one song I'm quoting from Steve Camp, if I remember the lyrics. But I want to run a mission a yard from the gates of hell. Like, I want to go to the most dangerous place where the demons are going to be trying their best to get me. I don't want to be the white picket fence guy. I want to be the guy that's literally right on hell's doorstep, threatening them, but also knowing that they can certainly threaten my life, but I'm willing to lay it down for Christ. And I think there were some people, personality wise or whatever, where that just didn't resonate, where they just were like, I need to be in American Christianity. But there were some of us, personality wise and theological wise, where that was like just giving us the best medicine we could ever get. Like, yes, Jim Elliot, let's do it. Who the Lord says, who will go for me? And I'm like, I'll raise my hand. I'll raise, both hands, and I'll keep them raised. I will go for you. I'll do it. And there was obviously both a sense of internal pride, like, I'm willing to do it. Why aren't you guys? But also the sense of purpose. Like, we have a mission here. We have a real serious purpose in our lives. And it is to literally give our lives away, to die to ourselves, even if it's both obviously metaphorical at first in the sense of just putting away sin, but even if it's literal, die to yourself for the sake of sharing Christ with the lost. And yeah, when you get that stuff, that's like steroids for those of us who are in it to win it. It's just like, exactly. And I shudder to think about how much people like myself and others thought of him as a hero, and thought, and especially when you look at like the way he treated his wife, almost ignoring her for years. And it just is like, oh my gosh, like what a mind job we were in.
And it was like, I remember the big joke to the extent that, Circle of Missionaries has running joke. I don't know if anyone remembers the Christian recording artist Scott Wesley Brown.
I don't think I do know.
Really big back in the 80s, but he had a song called Please Don't Send Me to Africa.
I've heard that title. Yeah.
It was the closest thing to, like, if Weird Al was doing Christian spoof music, because it didn't, like, it was like, it wasn't a B-side song. It was the 10th song on the second side of the tape, and it didn't really fit in with everything else. It was kind of funny. It was just a song about how he loves air conditioning and stuff, and he doesn't want spears thrown at him. And I'll do anything you ask, Lord, please don't send me to Africa. And we would just howl. We'd listen to that, and we're like, oh yeah, that's so fun. I mean, we'd go, and we'd be happy to die by a spear if you told us to. But that was the highest form of humor that, as a missionary family, that we could think of.
Yeah, I remember the story I heard a lot was, if you were sitting in a church somewhere in some foreign country and suddenly you heard gunshots, and the soldiers come in and they see this picture of Jesus or whatever on the wall, and they put it down on the ground in front of you and say, spit on this and denounce Christ or die right now. And what would you do? And that was the big question to us. I heard that over and over. Would you spit on the picture of Christ? But it's going back to the picture of Jacob and Isaac and Jacob. It's almost like this, you get to a point where you're like, you know what? As bizarre as the question of would Isaac sacrifice Jacob question is, it's almost like God wants you to also be willing to put yourself on that. You don't need Jacob to put you there and sacrifice you. You need to be willing to sacrifice yourself. And obviously that's woven straight into scripture, especially remember in Romans, a lot of that. But you're a living sacrifice. And the beauty of that, it almost became esoterically beautiful to think, I'm willing to fully surrender. I mean, the idea of just surrendering to the point where all of the sin in you that you kind of hate, at that point, you're trying to hate it, at least, the sin in you that you hate, the selfishness, the self-centeredness that just says, I'm in control of my life. The spiritual side of you that hates that and says, I don't want to control my life. I want to completely leave my hands open to God to give and take away, even to the point of my own life. And it became, I can't think of a better word than esoteric, but it became almost like this spiritual high to say, I'm willing to die. I'm really, like, I'm not kidding. I'm willing to die. And it was like a euphoria. Not that you really, really wanted to actually go through the pain, but
Right.
you wanted the gloriousness of the epic story of, like, I don't want to be just another Christian. I want an epic story for the Lord.
Yeah, and what you said, it just reminded me, boys will be boys, and it doesn't matter if they're raised in a Christian house or completely secular, but you get, especially high school boys, you get a group of high school boys, and they're inevitably going to start telling stories about who's the badass, what their fight record is. Like, no high school boy has ever lost a fight on the streets in the history of ever. Everyone is undefeated. It's all been at least 40 fights. They're all 40-0. And if the fights, if ever a fight almost happened and then it got broken up, then they've got the heroic story about what they would have done if the fight had gone on. And so you get all these boys just posturing about what their fighting record is, what their fighting style is, how big of a badass they are. When you get a bunch of Christian boys together, it's how much torture they could endure for, like what you were saying. All right, so we throw the picture down and you're asked to spit on it. Okay, well, what if they were like holding you down, and then, like, they raped your mom in front of you and said, "We'll stop doing it, and or we're gonna flay your skin off," and then they'd sit there, and rather than telling, like, our street fight record story that showcases our badassery, to use an "It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia" expression, it's how much torture for Christ could we endure? We're just trying to outdo each other with horrific scenarios. And that's how we'd spend, like, a sleepover evening or something. We'd stay up all night with Doritos and Mountain Dew, just coming up with like the worst scenarios we could think of that we would be willing to endure for the word.
Mm.
And I mean, in hindsight, it's as dumb now. It's just boys talking about their non-existent imaginary um, fighting prowess, whatever. Because I think if any of us had actually been presented with a fraction of these scenarios that we came up with, we'd probably have wilted almost immediately. But yeah, for the glory of the kingdom.
Yeah.
Um,
So when you were at that point, I know you eventually did get into missions and worship. Was that, did you just kind of fall into that, or was that very purposeful? Did you actively go out to be a worship leader and a missionary?
Now it's very organic. So my mom put she had both my sister and I start piano lessons when we were four. When we were four, she had
Nice.
a rule that we weren't allowed to quit until we graduated high school.
Very
So
nice.
I think my first public performance, it was Mother's Day. I was 6 years old. I've been working up this rendition of "Oh Lord, Our Lord," the song, and so I went down in front of the whole congregation on the grand piano on the stage, played and sang, 6 years old. That was my first public show. So I was kind of, anytime I could be on a stage, it was sort of natural.
Was it
Through
like a euphoria when you're the
what's
worship
that?
leader? Is there like a euphoria that happens when you're the worship leader? Like kind of an out of body experience?
There is, and it's different, because I still do music and I've played around the world for huge crowds. And I was talking with a Brady fanatic about this. He was big in the Christian hip hop scene. Um, that there's what every artist is looking for is like a connection between the crowd. Like there's nothing greater than like when you hear crowd singing back your own songs, and like that scene, or where the artist sings the first line and then he holds the mic out and the audience gives back. That's kind of that's what every singer performer that I've ever known, that's kind of like how you've arrived. Because most of us, like if you're not out, I haven't gone out there playing my own music for lyrical stuff. So when been on the road, it's been playing keys for somebody else's band, rather it was a cover band or a tribute band or even an artist doing their own music. You could be on the stage and you see the whole crowd, but they're not ever coming back with your lyrics. And there's a thing that happens in a worship where it's a bond with you two, because the adulation, you're not supposed to be the focus when you're on the stage. You're like the spotlight directing the focus, showing everybody you're supposed to be looking over here, but people are people and you can have the best of intentions. And the fact is psychologically you can know, all right, I told everybody to focus over there, but that's where they're looking with their spiritual eyes. These two eyes are looking right here and they're applauding. And if I say stand up, all right, close your eyes and sit down, put your hands in there, I got hundreds or thousands of people doing exactly what I'm telling. There's a little power trip there. There's applause after all the songs. And so there's a weird ego trip that I think is almost inescapable. That it's a little bit perverse because you're kind of taking somebody else's glory for yourself, but you also have a correct intention of not aiming for it. Because where the secular artist on the stage wants that adulation coming back at them, where the worship leader goes, okay, something magical happened today. This wasn't a normal church service. The spirit showed up today. Like the visual representation I can give, it's kind of like what they do with the unity candle at wedding ceremonies. You got a flame here, you got a flame here. You put the two flames together, and the flame that's created is bigger than the sum. It's higher than the other two by themselves. And when you get this collective worship where people go, the spirit showed up, it's the people in the audience are feeling it, but the worship leader is also feeling something bigger than themselves. So in that moment, it's not about you, which it's the pure moment that you're actually going for. They're rare, And you go, okay, that's what I meant for it to not be about me. And in that moment, I felt like it wasn't about me. And so as a worship leader, you never lose, because you either get that thing that you were going for, or that moment doesn't arrive, and you don't like, you're just in the secular moment where people are like doing whatever you say and clapping after you do a song. And so it's like a win-win. Um, so I don't know very many people who get into worship leader, and then just from the experience it becomes a turnoff. Like, you just everything about it's enjoyable, especially if if you happen to be a musician anyways.
Yeah.
But for me, just being in music, it was a very natural thing.
Mm. And kind of looking too at the same time behind the scenes, not just your public face, your worship music and so forth, but just privately with you and God. And as you were a late teen, as an early adult, did you feel like you were growing in your, knowledge of the Lord, love of the Lord, love of his word, and just that sense of going to him, that's like it says, pray without ceasing, almost like it's becomes part of breathing. You're almost breathing prayer. You're just talking to God constantly. Did you feel like that was growing, or did you feel like there was any distance there?
I didn't progress in my Christian walk in a way that was consistent with what the people around me told me they were experiencing or what I should be doing. Because what you just articulated, like, as you grow, you pray more. It is the pray without ceasing. And so I would always be impressed by these people who could make these long. We used to joke and call them a pray off. The scene from Zoolander. It's a walk off. It's a walk off. They're having a walk off, guys. It wasn't an intentional competition, but we call it a pray off, because you get these intercessory scenarios where it was like the people are trying to outdo one another with the pious language. And it was also a time to show off your proficiency of scripture memorization, because they'd always be like, oh Lord, it says in your word in Ezekiel chapter 26. And I'd be like, why are you reminding God what's in the book he supposedly wrote, whatever? But and I think it was for the benefit of the audience, be like, see, I memorized Ezekiel 26:13 or whatever the passage was. And if you could pepper in a whole bunch of those in your prayer. Oh, and then in First John, it also says this, and so we claim this for, and just like Peter, where it says in your word, and these just these prayers would go on for, like, it seemed like for an eternity. And then when they were done, then the next person has to kind of like out posture
Yeah.
the prayer. And so I was
Sometimes
like,
in
okay,
King
so that's
James,
a
sometimes in King James
sign.
English,
What's that?
sometimes in King James English.
Sometimes it was, you don't talk like that. Like, why are you acting all uppity right now? That's not how you say words. Um, but I remember even from a very young age being cognizant of the fact that this happened. And just like the same way, like, I know I'll be an adult when I start driving a car, or when I'm able to vote, when I start getting having more access to these grown-up things. It's like I'll know that my Christian walk is getting stronger when I can start doing these things. Like, well, I can't wait till I have my first pray off. I wonder if it'll be against one of my peers, like maybe when I'm 13 or something. Or I wonder, what if it's an adult? What if I get into a pray off with an adult? I wonder if I could beat an adult at a pray off. And like, these are the kind of like 6, 7, 8 year old thoughts that you have. And it was getting older and going like, I'm not like, I'm not getting better at it, but I also don't feel the inclination to. Um, And I remember going to, like, every summer, it seemed like we went to a Christian summer camp, and like part of the daily activity was like there's an hour of daily devotionals. So I remember this one camp that we were at, big old dorms, everyone gets up at whatever, we go to breakfast, and then everyone goes out kind of in the woods, and like, it's find a tree or find a rock, take your Bible, and you just sit there and take a notebook with you, and you read your Bible for an hour, and you write down what God is pressing upon your heart. And I would get so bored trying to read the Bible, and I'd be like, what's wrong with me? Like I'd get convicted that something spiritually was wrong with me, because like I look around and there's 40 other boys that are all just like reading their Bible, or at least pretending to. And I'm looking at the birds, and I'm looking, and I could sit there if I close the Bible, I could sit there all day long and not be bored with my surroundings, and just taking it in and be like, look at how beautiful the trees are. Wow, the way the sun's hitting my face. This is amazing. It's kind of like what people, when they talk about I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, and I feel more at one with things when I'm in nature and just experiencing the beauty of it. Like looking back now, I go, well, I was kind of having that spiritual experience without the religious trappings, and the religious trappings were what was hindering the spiritual experience. And I distinctly remember being in church when I was probably 16 or 17. We had one of these pastors. He was old. He should have retired like years earlier. It was, they would go on for so long. He'd go on tangents. And it was like, even if you wanted to pay attention to the message, it was so hard to follow what Pastor Ray was talking about. There were so many, like, is this a tangent? Is this the point? Like, I just like, I'm not following any of it. And it's like, you're checking your watch. Is this going to come on, get to the point? Can we have the altar? I'll come down. I'll get saved again if we can go home, please. And the church was right across the street from a little park, and right on the Allegheny River was right there in Pittsburgh. And I remember I'd get up if the sermon was going, and I'd just go down to the river and just sit on the dock and just like throw rocks in, and just feeling at peace. And it's like, this is like, I had to get out of stuffy church to go, this is, I think I'm having the experience right now that people think they're supposed to have inside. And one day my dad, because I'd sit down with the youth kids, and one day my dad had seen me get up and walk out and not come back in. And he got up and came looking for me, and he found me like a half hour later. And he's like, what are you doing down here? He goes, church is inside. And I was like, Dad, I just, and I couldn't talk. Like I wanted to articulate what I'm saying right now out here. This peace and serenity, the peace that passes all understanding, to put it in the terminology that you guys know, I'm experiencing right here. And all he could see was, you're being disrespectful to your parent. Like, you represent our family. You get up and you walk out of the service. You're disrespectful to the pastor. You are misrepresenting. You're a leader to, you're part of this youth group team that goes into the Sunday school, and you help out. If the kids in there know that you're walking out of church because you're bored or whatever, you get in there and you suck it up. And it's like, I felt like I was having a moment like me and God out here. Like, I didn't hear his words, but like I felt his presence in nature beside the river, whatever. And so now I'm going back in with the boring noise, and it's like, it's sterile. It's like the difference between being in a hospital and being like in a recovery center.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking that you were
or
interrupted like that.
So there were a whole lot of moments that, looking back, I went, I'm not progressing in the way, because I thought progress meant I got more able to sit there quietly reading the Bible and praying. And then I could come, and my mom's favorite conversation, every time we get on the phone, she'd be like, so what's God doing in your life today? And there's like this pressure to go, oh boy, well, what's God doing in your life, Mom? And I know she's going to go for 15 minutes. So that gives me time to be up in my head trying to come up with something for God to have done, because I can't be like, I don't feel like God did anything.
That's when you just say, ditto, Mom, ditto. Same thing for me.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Mom. Oh, I feel you. Because they wouldn't say I'm disappointed, but you know how your parents have this way of expressing disappointment without flat out saying it. And if you weren't able every time you talked to say a thing that God was doing, you felt like you let them down. And they would express, or at least my mom would. My dad was way better about not doing that. You feel like you let them down if you couldn't say what God had done in the 4 days since you had talked. And like my mom would be like, well, I was just talking, you remember so and so from church, and she was telling me God had done this in her life. And oh, last week I ran into so and so at the grocery store, and she was telling me God had done this and God was moving in their kids' lives. And I was like, man, I am all of these people have God doing stuff in their life, and God just isn't ever doing anything in mine. And there was always, the older I got, the more frustrating it got, because I was aware, I hadn't yet drawn the thing of maybe he's not doing anything. Maybe these other people are making up their stories too, or what they're calling God. Or my mom loved to use the term divine appointments, which is, we'd call providence or serendipity or a coincidence. If you bumped into somebody that you knew and you weren't expecting to meet them, well, that's divine intervention. Or if you met somebody that you didn't know and you talked about a thing and one of you had a thing that was useful for the other person to hear, that was a divine appointment. And so, okay, well, so basically, if you can argue that anyone, if you meet somebody you know or somebody that you don't know are both divine appointments, then obviously your life is going to seem like it's filled with divine appointments. But if you just consider that a meeting and you don't ascribe some agency to an invisible skyman orchestrating it, like playing puppeteer, which I didn't do. It was hard for me to do. I was like, well, oh, I met a cool person today, and I'm like, oh, sounds like God did it. Well, I don't know. He didn't say, hey, I'd like to introduce you to somebody. I just bumped into him. And so I kept going. I wondered, am I ever going to get to progress to the stage of Christianity where I enjoy reading the Bible ad nauseum and I can do it without checking my watch? When I can sit there and just pray and pray and pray, and I'm going, is this going to end soon so I can go outside and do a thing I like? The peaceful feeling that I get being outside, being outdoors in nature, will I ever get to where I can experience feeling that in church? Like I feel like I'm a bad Christian because all these other people are experiencing things that I'm not feeling. I can put my hands up, I can come down. I wanted to get slain in the spirit so bad. Like I'd go down and I just fall over because other people are falling, and I'd be like, well, I don't want to be the one guy that doesn't fall over. But I'd fall over and like when the guy comes and he pushes you, like, I'm going down just so I could be like, yeah, I fell over. I got slain in the Holy Spirit.
Hmm.
Never actually did, and I was like yearning for it because I see it happening to everybody around me. What is wrong with me that I'm not having these epiphanies or these come to Jesus moments? I'm not enjoying it, and I'm not getting out of it what you guys are apparently getting out of it.
Hmm.
And it was frustrating, and it's like that didn't make me leave. That made me want it even harder because I want this thing. Like and it was just like a search, like trying everything. And that was one of the things that led me out on missions on my own. um Getting into worship later in life. um Once I got out of high school, and my mom's like, all right, well, you did, as far as piano, you did what I asked, which was you stuck with it until now you're on your own. And that's like, well, I'm going to pursue it now of my own volition. And it was kind of in this eternal quest to capture that elusive spiritual experience that everybody else appears to be having that I wanted so badly. Um,
I was just going to jump in real quick and say
yeah.
one quick thing about I had a similar experience of sorts with the whole wondering if there's something wrong with me. I had I did an internship under my pastor for a year. It was part of the pastoral program at the school I went to, and at one point I met with the pastor all the time, but at one point I was really starting to branch out and trying to meet one-on-one with all the elders, and this one elder who I guess was a little bit more charismatic than the rest, because I think it was a very conservative church where I think most people would have probably not quite agreed with the way this went down. Anyway, this one elder, he and I are meeting Wednesday night or something after everyone's gone from the Wednesday night service. We just get some chairs in the back foyer and start chatting. And he starts like these deep, almost like sighs, like it's like, Tim, tell me, what is the Lord teaching you these days? And he phrased it like, what is he specifically saying to you? What is God telling you these days? And I was raised like theologically that was kind of like shifty because you could make up anything. It
Mm-hmm.
was always like God isn't saying something to you, he's saying something to everybody, and it's in his word. And if you want to hear him, you hear him through his word, not through your, through your own ears. So I was used to that more conservative perspective, but he was coming at it like no, you need that, but you also need to hear from God. He needs to be putting stuff in your heart. And he asked it like 3 or 4 different ways. And I was like, I don't think I've ever heard God the way you're describing. And you could just see his face like visibly change. He was like, you're about to graduate a pastoral program to become a full-time pastor of a church, and you've never heard God personally speak to you. And I mean, I was like, I don't even know what to say.
Mm-hmm.
It was intimidating at the time. I chalked it up to maybe we were theologically just using different verbiage, and maybe he meant something a little bit more like I was thinking, and maybe I was thinking something a little bit more like he meant. But it was kind of weird because I felt like maybe there's something wrong with my ability to hear God or to sense his spirit. And that it really sent me to a tailspin, wondering what is it like to really be close to God? Like if God, and it makes sense if from the perspective, like if God is truly on your heart all the time and you're constantly praying, he's going to put convictions on your heart and he's going to speak to you, not necessarily as it were canonically, of course, but just he's going to speak to you in a way that you can truly sense because you're that close. I mean, if you're a real relationship, with you with your wife, you're going to talk all the time. There's going to be a back and forth, and there should be a back and forth between you and God the same way. But I didn't have it, and I felt like exposed. Like I didn't expect the question in the first place. So I was like, I feel like I just got exposed as maybe I'm a fraud. And I knew I wasn't a fraud in the sense of my passion and zeal. I loved the Lord. I loved the word. I was willing to do anything for the kingdom and the gospel. But because I hadn't heard God's personally speaking to me, it was like, I guess my faith or my walk is defective in some way. And it threw me for a loop for a while.
And there was, to add on to that, there's the phrase, the still small voice inside of you, that you hear quite a bit. And they tell you that once, Jesus comes to live inside of you, and especially if you start speaking in tongues, the Holy Spirit also moves in, and then Jesus and the Holy Spirit, I get the roommates. I don't know what the bunking situation is in who's got the top bunk in that. I would love to. That's a deep theological question that I want answers to. But there's the kind of the Lord speaking to you where you feel something pressed upon your heart. This you feel a still small voice. They'll tell you it's your conscience, whatever. It's when you feel very strongly. And if you had that, at least, then if you weren't like hearing the audible thing, because I remember one of the pastors that came in. He like came to our church in Texas for like a week. His name was Jesse Duplantis. He's actually a big televangelist now. I think he's got a church in Atlanta, somewhere in Georgia. He's one of those people that like pals around with Kenneth Copeland, and has like a bunch of jets and stuff now. But when he came and visited First Assemblies of God in Wichita Falls, Texas, back in the mid '80s, it was before he had got on the whole like, I'm going to use, I'll become a charlatan for $1 billion, what kind of thing. And his down home way of talking to the audience was, the Lord said to me, and the Lord would say, Jesse. And I'd say, what, Lord? And he'd say, Jesse, I want you to do something for me. And Jesse would say, well, yes, Lord, I'm going to do it. And then he goes, I realized I was sitting on an airplane right now. And so everybody's looking at me. It's kind of funny because I just been having a conversation with God right now. And I said, yes, Lord, you tell me what you want me to do. And everybody's looking at me, and I don't care about all these, the flight attendant and my passengers next to me, because God's more important than these people. And when God speaks, you just, you want to listen. And sometimes God will wake me up from a dead sleep in the middle of the night. He'd wake me up and say, Jesse. And I say, yes, Lord, I'm here. And I was like, wow, okay. So there's like this level. Of course, I'm like 9 years old when I'm hearing this kind of thing. But, and we've got the Bible stories that there's a precedent for this. What was the story about the young man who was I don't remember who the character was that was getting woken up in the night by God's voice. He thought Elisha was calling him, whatever. He said, you keep calling me.
Yeah, Samuel.
And the prophet says, was it Samuel?
I think so, yeah. As this child.
He said, okay, so. Instead of running to me next time, say, yes, Lord, I'm here. So we've got this Bible story that does set a precedent. So sometimes God wakes you up calling your name. So if Jesse Duplantis is saying that God's waking him up, well, that validates the Bible. And now that lets me know that that is yet another level of listening that I can get to. Well, obviously I never got that. Most of the people in hindsight now, I suspect it might have been just an entertainment embellishment, showmanship kind of thing. I never had that, but I did have like the inner monologue, and then like studying psychology in college sort of started the framework for ruining, like sending me off the path, because we start learning, all right, wait, there's biological explanations for a lot of the things that we're told have spiritual explanations. So finding out that inner monologue, everybody doesn't have it, but it's a way bigger percentage of the population than just those who have accepted Jesus into their heart. And finding out, okay, your conscience, this seems to be like a universal concept. This thing that people were talking about, listening quietly, sometimes, because they'd be like, sometimes you don't know the answer to a problem, and then it will just pop into your head. That's the Holy Spirit telling you. That is God speaking to you. And then we find out, well, that's how people solve like math problems. This is like inventors. Like, this is just a function of being a human being. If you've got a working brain, you're not in a coma. Sometimes the answers will just come to you. If you sit there quietly, it'll pop into your head. And like, I remember one of my lit teachers had given me this. He goes, if there's ever, that sensation when you're trying to come up with a word and it's right on the tip of your tongue, you're reaching for it, you can't get it. Stop trying to get it. Think about something else, and invariably, like 2 minutes later, it's just going to pop into your head. So if you want the word, and yeah, okay, and so you can kind of call that up on command now. And I've had that since then. I'm like, okay, well, I've had that it's popped up on how to connect whatever cables were making the computer and the fax machine not connect, whatever was making the sound in my car, whatever was wrong with the washing machine. Like, solutions to things will just pop into your head. It could be work related, it could be inconsequential stuff where you're just sitting there, you focus your attention on something else, and an idea will suddenly hit you, and you go, okay, this has nothing to do with, this is not a Christian revelation. This is just an innocuous thing about whatever. And these people on the other side of the world that are of a different faith or of no faith are constantly talking about the same thing. So this sort of robs all of the Christians of this talking point, this thing that said, if you experience this, this is the evidence for this power that we're talking about. And then you go, well, wait, everybody's like, even after I renounced the faith, that didn't dry up. This thing that I thought was the Holy Spirit giving me like insider trading information, that thing didn't leave just because I go, okay, I don't believe this stuff anymore. I renounce whatever I said. Like, there's not, like, you're not all of a sudden cut off from what you thought was your source of extraneous information or input. It's still there. It still works fine. You're like, okay, so it wasn't what they were calling it in the first place. And that's,
what age were you when this started to really hit you?
so I began my deconversion about 3 years into Nashville, which I came here 3 years after college.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I came here the year after college. 3 years after coming here is when I like started deconversion, and I was receptive to it because going through, there were two things. It was one, minoring in psychology, and two, one of my best friends in college was a magician. He's still, he's an international, Carl Coppertop. Carl, if you're watching, hey buddy, you ruined my faith. Thanks a lot. Because I'd been into magic since I was a kid, and Carl would show me his tricks because, everybody, when a magician does a trick, everybody always goes, the first thing they say, how'd you do it? And he wouldn't, if they're a good magician, they won't tell you, but I was actually genuinely involved in learning. And so he would let me in on some and use me as like a gimmick or a patsy in like group routines and stuff. So going through 4 years of college with him, I saw him do thousands and thousands of performances and get to be there in the group, or once the trick is over, watching how people, the wrong conclusions people come to about how it was done. And like there was a particular card trick that he taught me early on. It was one of my favorite tricks. I could never do it nearly as good as he could. It was fairly simple. And I probably, in my time at school, listened to 500 people tell me how they think he did it, and none of them were correct. And because it was a Christian school, I will never forget. We were having somebody's birthday party at somebody's apartment, and Carl was, doing he did like close-up magic, like David Blaine, like get up and levitating stuff, whatever. But I remember him doing a series of tricks for these two girls. We were, I think, juniors at the time. They were freshmen. And afterwards, I saw three girls in the corner of the room. They were holding hands, they were bowing their heads, and they were having a prayer circle because they thought Carl was possessed by the devil. They reported him to like the campus. I don't even remember what the name of the office was, where people who do like morally bad things, not like stealing something, but like if you have a drink or if you're in a girl's dorm too late or whatever. They reported him, and he had to call in for a disciplinary hearing for witchcraft. And like these people genuinely, it never crossed their mind for 1 second that this is a trick. It's sleight of hand. You could go buy the thing at a store for like less than $7 and learn to do the thing that has got you so upset that you honestly believed that there is supernatural activity involved. You're trying to filter what happened through your belief system. You're completely wrong, and you're screwing somebody else's day up because of it. So, and I think just watching, like, that was the most severe reaction to it. Obviously, Christians will have different reactions than secular people to magic that they perceive as, well, obviously there has to be, like, this is a question or a statement I heard so many times. There has to be something to all that, because there is no way to do what he just did. And he goes, they're wrong. That's the answer, is they're wrong. There is a way to do it, and I did it. And magicians know this. I think it's like scientists and magicians are two of the fields that are most prone to atheism, because magicians are, scientists, their whole thing is learning how things actually work. And magicians, it's learning how things work that appear magical and watching people tie themselves, contort themselves, trying to come up with explanations, failing almost 100% of the time to explain it, but then walking away convinced they've got it was magnets. I know it was magnets. He had magnets. It's 9 times out of 10, it's never the magnets, but it's always the magnets. So I think, going as Christians, we are primed to come up with wrong explanations for things that have mundane explanations, and two, being constantly taught that these mundane things are actually spiritual things that it turns out they're not. Having those two firm bases there, I think it made it easier once I started the deconversion to draw on those two things that I already knew and be like, those certainly made me more malleable. And it's even now, like when I try to, I don't actively try to deconvert people, but I think using magic tricks is an effective tool. Just going, here, I'm going to show you something incredible. Now tell me, what do you think happened? Come up with as many explanations. And some people are like, well, it was just magic. There's no possible way. I'm trying to illustrate a point that there is something at work that you're not aware of, and then show them how it's done. Go, this is what we did. Here's from start to end. And now I want you to watch. Now that you know how it's done, let's go watch me do it to this person over here and watch their reaction, and see if you see some of yourself, retroactively. See when you're seeing their face and you see them going through the machinations in their head, trying to figure it out. Do you recognize what they're doing? Can you see that you're doing it? Can you see how maybe you might be doing this in other facets of your life, other than just trying to understand this trick? Whether it's overcoming a theological teaching or conspiracy theory in the modern world, because conspiracy theories are sort of the political version of God of the gaps. We have a gap in our knowledge. We're not comfortable with it. We'd rather have a wrong answer than no answer. There's a whole, let's fill it in with something. And so this willingness to embrace outlandish conspiracy theory, I think that's why Christians, because the whole point of that book was Pew Research showed that the number one predictor for embracing QAnon was being an evangelical Christian. That that demographic was more prone than anyone else to embrace total nonsense. And that was the premise of the book, was why? What is it? What are we taught that makes us so susceptible to these outlandish and border, they're incoherent, it's nonsensical, but now this new line of conspiracy theory is dangerous to society. It's having real world repercussions. And it was this ignorance that we're raised with, where people who, they don't know psychology, they don't understand science, they're making up answers that conform to their belief system and are confirmed by their belief system. So it's, confirmation bias. The answers are completely wrong, and they don't have the tools in their toolbox to understand how they might have gotten veered off in the wrong direction. They're just so arrogantly convinced they got it right.
What's hard about that too is that all these things that you're pointing out about their thought process and how it needs to be, so much more carefully thought through. What's ironic to me is that they would look at atheists or, people with a more scientific or secular or rational perspective, and they would say the same thing. It's fascinating that they see us as being the people that aren't putting the pieces together rightly, and that are have a huge bias, and that have a huge inability to see the cognitive dissonance that's occurring. It's really weird to me that both sides see each other that way, and it's been one of the most frustrating things, is that you want to make a case and say, don't you see what you're doing with these mental gymnastics? And they kind of say it right back to you. Don't you see what you're doing with your atheist mental gymnastics? It's very frustrating. You have to get to a point where you're like, we're just going to have to agree to disagree, because, but it's heartbreaking to me that, I mean, at the end of the day, you just have to say, based on where I'm at and based on what I think and what I know and what seems really healthy versus what seems toxic, what seems logical versus what seems foolish, based on where I'm standing, I think I'm being more rational than this group or that line of thinking. But it's frustrating that, to me, that there's some people, like, when they get so deep into it, they're not only into the theory that they're into, but they're into justifying their logic that got them there, and they're into making sure you look foolish for not having arrived at the same conclusion. It's I think a lot of times it just makes it to the point where you just can't talk to certain people. Like I remember the years ago hearing Dawkins asked, why don't you spend more time debating creationists? And he said, it's the same reason I wouldn't debate someone about the stork theory of reproduction. He's like, it's just so silly. But, but yet they're convinced. And it's really, it makes for some interesting situations for sure.
Well, you said a key phrase a few minutes ago. You said both sides think about the other, and there's a phrase, it seems to be the left uses it in their critique of right-wing media, but the expression is both sidesism. Both sidesism. They're doing whatever they're doing it. We're doing it. Both sides. Well, what about them? What about ism is another kind of tangentially related thing. And I remember this being a very prevalent thing especially in Christian apologetics, which is something that I got very heavily into for me, because I didn't need the intellectual exercise. And if you're a Christian, that is your intellectual outlet, is apologetics. If you want to do debate and argument, then you read I was reading evidence that demands a verdict, Josh McDowell, I think, when I was like 9 or 10, and memorizing the chain of argumentation that was supposed to lead a person until they inevitably arrived at your conclusion. And it's not like till you go learn formal logic when you go, oh, well, he made so many just logical fallacies to get there. But in Christian apologetics, one of the things that they love to do is the both sidesism. Well, atheists, it requires as much faith, and they try to present atheism as religion. just something that you hear all the time. Well, that's a religion too. What's the difference? And you go, well, if you really break down the definition of a religion and, being where your focus and your attention and your worship, if you're doing some worship, is directed at a supernatural entity. Well, a naturalist, by definition, doesn't accept that there are supernatural entities. They don't really worship anything. They do have sort of, if you want to say they have a reverence for something, it's the scientific method and the process that's the best process we know of to come to correct conclusions. Even though we're wrong sometimes, there's still not a better way to get there. If there is, we'll adopt it. And I go, well, see, they've got faith in the scientific method. How is that any different than us? And so when you're only on the one side, the both sidism is a compelling argument in your mind until you've actually been on both sides and go, wait, over here, what we thought they were doing when I was over there, nobody's actually doing that over here. It's not that at all. It's the complete opposite of it.
Yeah. But you just can't see it when you're in it. Like, you just can't.
Yeah, and actually, one of the final chapters in the conspiracy book was one of the thought processes, the calling of sheep. How, like, both sides love to, well, you're a sheep. No, you're a sheep. Well, that's what a sheep would say. Well, that's exactly how a sheep would respond. And so you've got these two groups of people accusing each other of behaving like sheep because both groups are collectively saying the same things to the other side. But then you get to the other side and you go, well, they're doing it for a very different reason. It's like everybody over here is saying the same thing. The reason that 5 times 5 is 25 is because everyone over here worked the equation out. And if you do your math correctly, you inevitably arrive at the same conclusion. Everybody over here is saying 5 times 5 is 30 because their pastor all told them, or this ancient goat herding book, the Goat Herder's Guide to the Galaxy, because I heard somebody make the joke about online, referencing the Bible. It told them this was the answer, and they said, we can't question it. This book is infallible. So you've got two groups of people who are collectively saying the answer is a certain thing, but for very, very different reasons. One, because someone told them, and these people here, they worked the equation. And so they're not on equal footing, and it's not both sidesism at all. And it's like, I love, if I could just, you don't have to come over here and stay over here. Just come over here for a second and visit. And then you go back to your faith-based approach to everything.
Exactly.
And for one of the things it was for me getting out of it, going, one of my biggest hindrances is the way words work when you grow up in the church. And the difference between knowledge and belief, those words are not synonyms, and they're kind of used. They're used interchangeably, and we're told that our belief is knowledge. And we just go around patting ourselves on the back. I know this. I know it. I know it in my heart. I know it in my heart of hearts, which is it's the sub-basement of your heart. And things you know in your heart of hearts are more truthier than things that are in your regular heart. And you go, well, I know this. And you go, no, that was belief that we were calling knowledge to make what we thought or felt give it more prominence. It's degrees of certainty. And like a thing that we know, we'll say we know the periodic table. We're certain on the periodic table. We're certain about we're certain about apes. Our degree of certainty about Bigfoot or an ape man, well, we haven't caught one yet. We don't have tangible evidence for. So even if you believe it, that can't be the same thing as knowledge. You've got to leave room for yourself to go up if you ever get that certainty. And so what we call that out in the secular world, we call that belief. Like in the presence of knowledge, belief is not necessary. Belief is what you have to do because knowledge isn't available. And I go, like, I don't know, the Bible talks about how the importance of faith, and you go, well, faith isn't necessary if you have concrete proof. If the concrete proof is what makes certainty and what therefore leads to knowledge, you're claiming to have knowledge about a thing that it hinders your salvation if you don't have the faith. So the faith is a requirement, but you're calling it knowledge. And you guys have messed yourselves up because you're using the words wrong. And it's once you get out and you go, I spent 25 years of my life calling this thing knowledge, that I know something, and go, now I realize that I was wrong. Looking like I know this, I know that apes are real. I believe or disbelieve in Bigfoot. I know horses are real. I believe or disbelieve in unicorns. Um, Understanding the difference between the belief and knowledge, I think it's possible if you spent an entire lifetime in knowledge, or if you've spent an entire time in belief and then come over to knowledge. I think it's almost impossible if you spent your whole entire time in the belief section, because you cannot compare and you don't know what you've been telling yourself that something that isn't knowledge is. And then when you finally have things that are, you finally see the difference. You go, man, I was so wrong. I was just, it was one of my biggest hindrances for so long, was just using these words incorrectly.
I think too about how they often mix in the idea that if you have sort of like a blind faith, that is really a virtue. The doubting Thomas story, of course, but just this sense, like I remember growing up a lot hearing the stories of some missionary, I think it was British, but he ran an orphanage or something. And there were these stories where there would be like no food for the whole school of orphans. Like there's just nothing. And instead of going out to the churches and begging or doing something, the man that was in charge of this was just like a man of faith. And so he would just pray, and he just knew that God was going to provide. And sure enough, they hear these stories of, we're out of, we've got food, but we've got no milk for the kids. Sure enough, the cart that's delivering the milk around the town, it breaks down, and by the time they get the milk back to the shop, it's going to be bad. So they need to basically just give it to you, because there's nothing we can do about it. It's a dud. And so over and over and over, they would have these stories of this man of faith who would believe, and it was no evidence that God was going to come through. And yet in these stories that they told, I don't know how many of them were actually accurate, but in the stories that they told, the faith was like, it's like the key. It was like the magic key to it actually becoming true. And you have to ask yourself, what point does this become more like make believe? But I remember too that the other side of this is, besides just that blind faith is a virtue, is that you also are shifting your worldview so much. Like you mentioned how you would kind of see, you'd see God working either way. Like if you bumped into somebody, it's providential. God made that happen. He wanted you to meet that person. Well, when you're doing that on so many levels for years at a time, you're just seeing everything as a God thing. Mm-hmm. Eventually, it isn't even like, well, God wanted you to bump into him, and that was the big way God moved in your life today. Like that one meeting was God. It becomes like everything is God. It's almost like the Matrix, when Neo first sees the code. Mm-hmm. It's like God wants you to see that his code of grace, his code of the gospel, his code of his holiness is woven through everything. And you just begin to see God and the Bible and the Christian worldview everywhere. And you almost don't need the proof. You just kind of see it. And it's crazy to think about what that does, what it takes to get a mind to that point. But I feel like I for sure was on that route pretty heavily. I remember I was writing a book even about Christian worldview. It was over 1,000 pages. Glad I didn't publish it. But it was 1,000-page book about Christian worldview and how we should see every single thing as part of God's design. In other words, we're going to fight evolution, not just because evolution is stupid, but because it's against the premise that God is arbitrary. God isn't arbitrary. Everything, the color of the robin, the way that the trees grow, everything you see around you, it's beautiful. It's part of God just splashing paint on his canvas, but he is not arbitrary. He's a master mathematician. He's brilliant beyond our comprehension. He is truly the smartest person you could ever imagine on a scale that we can't even grasp. And he's not going to just do stuff like just truly, like literally throwing paint around. he's going to do it in ways that are mysterious, but there's like things where you can uncover, oh, I see what God did there. Like a tapestry is like on the one side, it's all, random threads. You flip it, it's like, oh, there's a picture there. I didn't know that. And you get to a point where you just think every single thing in this world has God's fingerprint on it, whether I see it or not. I remember C.S. Lewis talked about the concept. I'm not sure if I remember the quote exactly, but he said something like, what if God, like people say, why don't I see God up in the sky? It's like, what if he's up there and he has actually written his name or something, but it's in letters that are too big for you to see? You're looking like if it's a, say it was a word with like an I with a dot, and all you see is a dot. You're like, but there's a whole sentence up there, and your focus is way too narrow. You just need to have eyes to see. And I think when you get in that worldview for so deeply, so long, it's like your trance. You begin to not need proof anymore. You see God in every little minute part of life, and it gets to a point where you really can't unsee it unless something really shakes you up, in my opinion.
Well, you used doubting Thomas, I think, to lead off with that, and that's actually the story that was the first chapter of the conspiracy book. Because my intention of writing it was not to. I feel like there's been enough like evangelical bashing or whatever, ridiculing, and because I have very close relationships and still a lot, even though there was a lot of messed up stuff from the church experience, I have a lot of fondness looking back. I still have very close relationships with people that I've, going back 40 plus years. So my goal was not to just ridicule a subset of society. It was to legitimately explain to people, because if you're an outsider looking at evangelicals, especially in the modern political context, and like how they're intrinsically tied up with this constant, like the QAnon stuff, it looks insane. If you've never been a part of it, it's incomprehensible. It just doesn't make any sense. And so the point of the book was, let me explain to you guys where we're coming from, how we get there. Because we're not trained to accept conspiracy theories. They don't tell us, hey, if you hear something, about satanic pizzerias in Washington, D.C. and the Democrats, it's probably true, but there's other thought training that comes with the territory of just being in the church. And you carry that training out into the world with you, and you don't just turn it off. You don't flip a switch and the training stops. And the doubting Thomas story is one of them. And this thought training, because when you go to Sunday school, the level of the teaching is not like what the congregants are getting from the pastor. They're very simple stories. It's like the basics. You got Adam and Eve, David and Goliath, Daniel and the lions and Noah's Ark. It's, the greatest hits is what I call it. There's like 20 greatest hits, and they just run them in a constant rotation. It's kind of like top 40 radio that just plays the same thing over and over again. And the doubting Thomas is one of the 20 greatest hits. And so when, in Sunday school, you're in there at 5, 6 years old, and you hear the story a couple times a year. And the moral of the story is, Thomas got rebuked. Jesus appeared to the apostles and they came and told Thomas, and Thomas didn't believe him. And it's a fantastic story. A guy that you watched with your own eyes be put to death has come back to life. And he said, I'll believe it when I see it. If I can put my fingers in the nail holes, then I'll believe it. And then Jesus appeared the next night and he said, Thomas, you've believed because you saw, but blessed are those who believed without seeing. And so he got like rebuked. He got, public, he got some public shaming. And we get this story over and over and over until we move from Sunday school out into the congregation. And then they're telling their own grown-up version of this thing. And so if you grow up in the church, you've spent years or decades being thought trained that there is virtuousness in accepting a thing that there is no evidence for. And it's not that they're two equal possibilities. You could believe because you've got evidence, or you could believe in spite of the lack of evidence. the one outweighs the other. One is almost a moral failing. To require evidence is a moral failing, and it's a teaching moment. If you succumb to that, going, wait, okay, I hear what you're saying, but that sounds unreasonable. You got any supporting evidence? Just accepting it, that's how you, it's an outward declaration of your piety. It's an outward show of your commitment to the Lord, is that you can embrace something that there's no evidence for. And it's not A or B and pick one. It's A or B and one. A. That's the one you should go for. So that it kind of goes a long ways to why are evangelicals so much more susceptible to conspiracy theory. It's because we've been trained that believing a thing that there's no evidence for is actually a good thing, not a bad thing.
Yeah, it's interesting too that in that mix, you get to a point where you look at cults, like a cult where even as a Christian you would have said that group's a cult, that group's a cult, Mormons and JWs. But even like when you look at the really weird ones like the David Koresh stuff, and you start to go through the resources that like cult experts point out of like what are the main dynamics of a cult leader and of a cult group, and one of them is like just complete assent and willingness to adhere to and obey without question whatever the cult leader says. And it's funny how you see that, you might say, well, if David Koresh had said do this and it was crazy, his followers would say, yes sir, we'll do it. And you say, that's nuts, why would you do that? Like, can't you see, or the Jim Jones stuff, like why would you drink the Kool-Aid? But at the same time, you begin to, in the deconversion process, or at least deconstruction, you start to realize that mainstream Christianity, in a sense, still requires that assent. Like there's this underlying proposition of the Bible is true, and whether you adhere to a really strict inerrancy or there's some leeway there with the way you interpret it, it's still ultimately from the true God, and you still have to rank your thoughts and your life under its authority, because it's God's authority. It's really, and the ability to say, I think, in my opinion, the ability to say this was a cult. Yes, it's a cult that has a lot more followers than these little teeny cults we see, but the fact that billions of people adhere to it doesn't make it any less of a cult. It still is, and that sense of you must bow your knee and assent, or else, it's truly an or else situation. It's overwhelming. I really feel heartbroken, especially for kids, when you realize that that's what they're being trained to do, is to say yes sir, yes ma'am to the pastor, to their parents, and they're getting to a point where they don't have any thought autonomy. Just like we would say to a kid, if say Uncle so and so comes over to the Christmas party, and he's a nice guy, he's not a bad guy, but for some reason the kids feel like he's creepy and they just don't want to give him a hug. We would all, I think, say that's fine, it's your body, if you don't want a hug, just say no thank you. Give him a fist bump or something. But as much as we would focus on kids' autonomy, it's like we're so used to training kids to lose their autonomy, like on the grandest scale. It's truly heartbreaking, especially once you're a parent. It's like you're just like, I can't fathom how I could have done that. And the ironic thing is, I was going to do it to my kids. I was going to brainwash them. Unfortunately, my deconversion occurred early enough that I was able to easily undo the damage. But had it been another 5, 7, 10 years down the line, it would have been crazy hard to undo the damage, because they would have again had that worldview of God is everywhere. And again, once you've got it, it's really hard to get out.
Yeah, and it's insane to watch right now, because it is a thing that you cannot see when you're in it. You have to step outside to look back to see what bubble you were in.
Yeah.
But now, because the term indoctrination, again, coming back to political discourse as it comes to like LGBTQ, transgender issues, the whole grooming thing that got attached to the drag thing, like all these indoctrination things, the right just pearl clutching and hand wringing about our kids are being indoctrinated, and what they need is we just need to get the Bible back in school, and like, you guys don't understand how that's an indoctrination. It's worse because it's real, and the things that you're worried about isn't really happening. So you guys are you're all up in arms about imaginary problems, but your solution is an actual version of the thing that you're hand wringing about. And like I just remember, because we spent a lot of time talking about cults in the evangelical church. A cult is a perverted form of Christianity. So like Mormonism is a cult, Jehovah's Witnesses are a cult. Like you mentioned, David Koresh, anybody out on a compound is a cult. If the leader of it has more than one wife or girlfriend, we don't even need to know what the beliefs are. It's definitely a cult. If Jesus has any siblings, if there's anything outside of the Bible, if there's another way to be saved, an alternative way to be saved, more than one way, anything, it's a perversion of their very narrow interpretation of the Bible is how you determine that it's a cult. And you get out and you go, well, there's one of the reasons I think people argue a lot about whether something is or is not a cult, because it is a word that does have two different valid meanings. One of them being something that is a perversion of a more largely accepted ideology, but the other one speaks to the behavior of the group, but it has nothing to do with the specifics of the belief system. So you could have a cult-like following of an innocuous topic. It doesn't have to be divinely related, religious related. We can talk about cult followings of movies or Elon Musk, whatever. And so a lot of times people will go, well, we're not this perversion of a thing, therefore we can't be a cult. And you're like, no, we're not talking about the cult that in that sense. We're talking about in the behavioral sense, where the thinking is insular. We don't allow outside input. We don't consider it. Dissent will not be tolerated. In the book, I use the concept of the Truman Show or M. Night Shyamalan's The Village, about you're in this thing, and that is the entirety of your worldview, and you don't know that's what you are in until you get out. You climb over the wall, you smash your sailboat through the painted wall, you get out and you realize, oh, this was a big bubble. Oh, what's going on out here? Oh man, I sure was in a cult, wasn't I? And I mean, I think you can make the theological, if you want to say that the belief is a perversion of something else. Even, Protestantism is sort of a perversion of Catholicism. We're not the most recent iteration of the theology, but certainly, at least the way evangelicals conduct themselves, it checks every single box in the psychological manual of what it takes behaviorally for something to be a cult.
Yeah.
And you can tell them, I think you're in a cult. And they'll be like, well, that's something somebody in a cult would say.
Exactly.
So
It always amazes
got
me
an answer
too.
for everything. And
It amazes me too that there's something that people talk about, the debate of whether or not there was an actual original Jesus, which I know we're not here to talk about today, but that topic of mythicism. But there's people that describe it as a conspiracy theory. And what's ironic to me is that the origins of Christianity themselves would have at that time been a conspiracy theory. Like the conspiracy that this character was dead and then he rose again, that he actually did raise Lazarus from the dead, that he actually could turn water into wine and walk on the water and blah, blah, blah. Like the whole thing originally was a conspiracy theory. So we're now talking about conspiracy theories about a religion cult that is founded on the conspiracy theory. And it's like there's no end to it. And it really, you kind of yearn almost psychologically for just a fresh slate to say, I just want to be free of all the lies and all the mythology, of all the deception, of all the bizarre stuff that I was so used to. And I think, kind of going to the topic we talk a lot about of religious trauma recovery, like even people that haven't been, abused by a priest or something or anything like that, there's still this religious trauma that's very generic of just like, my worldview was steeped in really bad thinking. And you have to undo not just was Christianity true, but how did I arrive at all these concepts? How did I get there? How did I accept it? The Stockholm syndrome thing. How did I love my captor? But as you weed through it, you realize you really do, even if you're feeling pretty healthy and you felt like your Christian life was pretty nominal and pretty good, um, you realize I have been training myself to accept really bad ideas for decades. And just because I'm now like okay, I realize Christianity was a really bad idea, you have to admit to yourself in humility that doesn't mean that you don't have the ability or that you're not actively accepting other bad ideas. Just because you're an agnostic or an atheist doesn't somehow make you brilliant. It just means that you've started a journey to undo some bad thinking and you've tackled topic number one. Yeah, was Jesus real? Is Yahweh real? No, that's we know that's mythology. But what else? Like it leads you to think, what else am I doing and what else am I thinking that's just based on completely faulty thinking? And you really realize it's a journey. This healing thing is a journey. And I've heard people say even years after deconversion, they realize that there's things that they've never thought through before. Like even, for example, that I was talking with someone the other day, the topic of sexuality and accepting that polyamory, for example, could be an option for some people. And there's people that I know have deconverted that would still like, no, 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 polyamory is not an option. But you realize, wait a second, why not? My morality was based on this Bible, which at least eventually, after they got out of the polyamory of the Old Testament and the the multiple wives and all that with Solomon and all these other guys. But when you realize that the story you've been handed is monogamy is the only acceptable sexuality, even after you convert, you're still in that mindset. And you have to undo it and say, well, I'm not saying I would want to do polyamory, but just to say, is it acceptable for some people? Well, yeah, actually it is. And it's amazing how you kind of have to keep on peeling back the layers of the onion, as it were. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. To your point about polyamory, because I do have a couple friends or acquaintances that's kind of how they live. But it wasn't polyamory, it was homosexuality. There were two things that kickstarted my deconversion process. And one of them, like in the church, there are so many types of people that you just don't associate with. And they're just like, I went through high school, I went through college. I think the first officially out gay person that I knew, I was waiting tables like junior or senior year of college, and one of my fellow servers in the restaurant was openly gay. I was like, yeah, that's weird when you're 20 years old and that's the first time you've met a gay person. Um, but when I finally got to Nashville, the two things that happened simultaneously is one, um, I'd gotten to be really good friends with a guy who was gay, and we were really close. He'd grown up in a Baptist house. So I was talking to him one night when I was still like right on the cusp of breaking out, and I said, I have to ask you, like, you know what the Bible says about being gay, so you know where you spend eternity. You know what, like, why would you choose to do this? And he looked at me like I had two heads, and he goes, Shane, if there was any choice in the matter, I would choose not to do this. Do you know how difficult it is? He goes, like, my dad tried to beat it out of me. I've been like, life has been miserable growing up in a like being gay. He goes, I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. I had never considered that ever. Like that was the first thing that, because it's a choice, it's a choice, it's a choice, is hammered into your head. I'd never considered that. And I was hearing it from a person, and I'm like, well, I can't, these people that are telling me what he's doing, I can't put that higher than him actually. Like I see the hurt in his voice when he's telling me his personal story, what he's going through, what he would prefer. Yeah, he was like, how old were you when you chose to be straight? I was like, oh, yeah, I guess I never did choose. Like it's such an easy response that completely breaks somebody's worldview. But I hadn't confronted that very simple question. And as soon as, so that kind of started the snowball. And then the other one was, I was reading my Bible at the time. I was reading the book of John. I actually wrote in the book what the thing was, because another thing is the Bible doesn't contradict itself. And one of the reasons so many people are able to walk around with that belief in their head is, for the most part, Christians don't read the Bible. It's a small percentage of them that actually read it. And then it's so long, it's not exactly a page turner. So, I make this joke that it's the only book that they've got like an instruction manual on how to get through it in a year. Like you go to Zondervan bookstore and it's be like, all right, so it's like the Christian equivalent of running a marathon. Like some people like that's my physical goal. Just once in my life, I'd like to run a marathon, 26.2 miles. Oh, it's not going to be this year. It might not be next year, but before I'm 40, before I'm 50, they keep pushing it back. It is that I want to make it through a marathon. For the Christian, it's making it through the Bible. And like that sort of thing, they have to get like a training regimen that goes, all right, on day 1, on day 16, you need to be reading this much, read this section. If you follow this manual, you can get through the whole thing. You get your medal. I read the whole Bible. Because it's not a compelling page turner. It's, the majority of it is like just mind-numbingly boring. And a lot of times to see the contradiction, they're in far apart sections that you've got to remember what you read over here. And if you read this part in February and you don't revisit the contradictory statement until the end of November, yeah, you saw the contradiction, but you don't remember. And it's, even the pastor he'll preach on a thing, and then he'll come back, 6 months later and preach on the contradictory thing, and nobody in the congregation remembers the sermon from 6 months ago. The pastor doesn't even remember it. Like, you don't remember that you told us the opposite of what you're saying now, because each thing happens in its own isolated little bubble. But it was, I guess, just serendipity. It was a divine appointment that I happened to flip to another thing that was the opposing verse. And it was about whether or not Jesus was a judge, because it was
Yes.
John 3:16 or John 3:17, where God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might have life through him. And then another section of John, Jesus says, I didn't come to condemn the world. And then you turn over here and it says, for judgment I've come into this world. God sent me into the world to condemn the world. And you go, wait. So did he come into the world to condemn the world or not? And it's like, well, it depends on which verse you're reading, because this one says yes and this one says no. This one says, Jesus is the judge, and then Jesus says, I judge no man in this other verse. So which one is it? And it's like, it was just a lucky happenstance that I happened to get just the right page flip. I go, I've never seen apologists tackle this, because they do love to solve contradictions in their apologetic works, and they've got like a go-to handful that they love to solve, because they're two opposing verses that aren't really contradictions. Like, we'll grant, yeah, the ones you've solved aren't contradictions, so thank you for solving the thing that no one was really saying was a problem. But there's a whole nother subset of contradictions that they won't touch. They've got the good sense. If nobody's going to mention it, we're not going to bring it to their attention. We don't have a solution, so hopefully nobody asks. So this was one that nobody had ever offered a solution for. So I didn't have, McDowell or C.S. Lewis or Lee Strobel or any of these, kind of more contemporary apologetic masters with their preconceived feedback telling me how the thing that I thought was a contradiction really wasn't, that I just understood it wrong. I was like, I wonder how many more are in here. And I spent about a month or two, and I went through the Bible, because I read it cover to cover 24 times, I think 23, 24, something like that. So it was like my 20th read through, 19th to 20th. I'm like, I'm going to go through again, and I'm going to read it as quickly as possible so that everything is fresh in my mind, so that I can, like, if I see, if the contradictory thing presents itself, it would have only been like a few days removed and not 9 months removed. And I remember coming up with, like, I had a spiral notebook that I had filled. It was like 40 pages, front and back, filled. And I was like, I gotta publish this. This is magical. And I had no idea that this like already existed. Like hundreds of people have already published it. I didn't know the Encyclopedia of Biblical Errancy was a thing. And so it was kind of devastating to discover that what I had discovered and thought was like new ground was, yeah, a tired old hat. I was just finding it myself for the first time. Um, but that the whole concept that gay people didn't choose to be gay, and also that there are contradictions in the Bible, was like paradigm shattering. Those are the two things that happened within like a conversation with Eric, and seeing those judgment contradictory passages. They were in like in a span of 3 days within each other. So
Were you at that point trying hard to stay, or were you feeling like your faith was just disappearing, or like was your goal at that point to save it, or were you more just like, I'm open to wherever, I just need to find the truth wherever it takes me?
I was not naturally opposed to it. My first response was to ask my dad for help.
Okay.
Dad, I've got all of these problems. And what I believed at the time was that there was a solution. I just wasn't advanced enough in my faith to know what it was.
Yeah.
And because, my dad is a pastor, my dad was, kind of the spiritual leader of the family, and something that, he's a shepherd that has a flock. Of course, I'm going to go to him. And he kind of briefly looked over. He goes, well, send me a few. And I emailed him to him, and he looked it over, and he had sort of a flippant response to it. And then just kind of didn't ever address it again. And I heard from my stepmom a couple years later. She's like, well, my dad thought you wanted him to help you disprove the Bible. And I was like, no, what I wanted was, I was finding things that disproved it to me. And my dad was the person I thought that could solve this for me. I didn't want his help. Well, I mean, I wanted his help, but not to disprove it, to show me how I was wrong and what I was finding. But it apparently was so threatening to him that he didn't address it to me. I'm like, well, so he's not going to do it. Who else who do I turn to? And everybody else was like much lower tier. And I got like a half dozen offers from people. I go, I tell them I'm going through I'm having a hard time. And one of the things that I used to love to do is when Jehovah's Witnesses would knock on the door, I love to debate them. So I would confuse them, because I was one of the people that would invite them in, and we'd have a conversation. And I love to play dumb. Like, I've read up on the Jehovah's Witness things. I know what their history is. I know where all their weak points are in their arguments and counter apologetics, but just playing dumb. And the furthest I ever got was 3 meetings. And then they didn't come back for a 4th meeting, because they realize what you're doing. And their whole thing is shunning, ostracizing people who don't agree with them. And it's like people who have the religious trauma from Jehovah's Witnesses. That's what it is. My parents, they won't speak to me, whatever. I kind of got this treatment from the people that would reach out and be like, all right, here's what I'm dealing with. Here's some of the stuff that I found. Here are problems I've got. Look at it. And they're like, yeah, we're happy to. They look at it, and they'd come back and be like, I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't think we probably shouldn't communicate anymore. So I don't know. I'm not inside their head, so I don't know what it prompted in them, what it sparked in them. It seemed like it was fear, which is, that's a driving force. It's a prime directive for some people. Is I don't feel equipped to handle what I'm being confronted with. Let's just, like the people that, the monsters can't get me if I'm under the blanket. I don't want to look out and confirm that there's not a monster there. I'd rather just sit here with the blanket over my head, because if it can't see me, it can't get me. I don't want to confront it.
Yeah. I think just to add to it, I think there's a sense too that they think it's just nonsense. It'd be like, maybe since we talked about Canaan stuff, if someone were to come to you, or even something even crazier, like look, I definitely saw aliens step out of their spaceship the other day. In a sense, maybe if it's your dearest friend and you want to give them the benefit of the doubt because you just love them, but if it's just a random person in your larger sphere of influence, if they're going to try to take you down some crazy path of line of thinking, this is nonsense, I honestly just like life's too busy. I'm not going to spend it on this kind of craziness. I think they kind of see it that way because I had something similar happen with a pastor that when I was on the verge of deconverting, and I reached out to a pastor who he'd been like a family pastor for years. Like he knew our family, he knew my mom, he knew my grandparents, like he knew generations of us. And I reached out to him and said, "Hey, I've got some serious questions about some stuff. I'd love some answers." And he said the same things. Like, "Can you send me what you're talking about?" I said, "Well, there's some videos I'd like to. Can I show you this? Send you this YouTube link. Can you just watch this and then can we discuss it?" And as soon as he saw what the YouTube link was, it was about ancient mystery cults. Um, he shut it down and just said, I'm not gonna do this. I'm not gonna have that conversation." And I doubt he would have framed it. I mean, maybe in a sense he was fearful. I doubt he would say it was fear alone, at least. I think he would have said this is just nonsense. And that's again, I keep saying the word heartbreaking, but it's heartbreaking that they see it in that frame that they can't entertain it, even if they're not afraid of the conversation. They're just like, we might as well be talking about the aliens you saw last night. This is just stupid. We know God is real. We know it. End of
Mhm.
story. And you're literally just wasting my time at this point. And I think it's just it's another example of how, like we've said, once you're in it, you can't see it until you're back out of it. You just can't.
And the thing that was now I think it's funny. Um, I had the presence of mind to recognize the falsity, like the glaring falsities of the belief system, the problems of that particular system, but I hadn't yet got a better processing tool bag. And so what initially happened is this bogus system just got replaced with another bogus system until I recalibrated my thinking, because I came out of the Christianity thing and I got really into like some new age stuff. I was all into like the healing power of crystals, and then I got into conspiracy theory. Like I got introduced to David Icke, who was like the precursor to Alex Jones, where the bloodlines of everyone from the Egyptian pharaohs to the Bushes are the reptilians, interdimensional, and the whole world is being controlled. I was like, oh, okay, well, I don't have to filter all these claims through the lens of Christianity anymore. So all of these other things are potentially true. And I didn't yet have a filter in place to go to how do we determine when you hear a claim of any sort, how do we determine if it's definitely true, definitely not true, or the degree? Is this probably true? Is there any evidence for this? I mean, it was still many years after that where I came to understand like really the scientific method. Without evidence, there's nothing higher than evidence. That's the highest you can get. And without it, like, okay, Shane, you're kind of an idiot. You just traded one evidenceless kind of set of nonsensical claims for a different evidenceless set of nonsensical claims. That's a lateral move. You haven't really evolved. Um, Good for you for setting down the one bag, or setting down the one poisonous snake. But if you just go grab a different poisonous snake and pick that one up, you haven't improved your situation. It's how do we stop avoiding picking up poisonous animals that could bite us? And yeah, it was years later where I was like, okay, I've got to rethink everything. I'm not helping myself. Um, I spent enough money on crystals this year.
Exactly. It's amazing how that works. And I think I think too, though, there is the other side to it that once you escape Christianity, you get so fed up with the bullshit that it's almost like you won't believe in anything unless you have hyper evidence. I mean, in a positive sense, like I think some of us, we think through the question of well, like when you eliminated Christianity as an option for reality, why didn't you immediately investigate Buddhism and Islam and yada yada? And I think so many of us were like, the deception was so deep and so profound and so long lasting that once you're out of it, you're kind of just sick of any of these claims, and you get to a point where you're longing for the freedom so deeply and so profoundly that you just want to kind of push all of it away and say, I don't want any of the claims near me. I just want to breathe. Like, I just want to breathe for the first time. I just like, I don't need to think through all the nuances of is it possible that there is an afterlife? Is it possible that the reincarnation stuff is true? Do people really have near-death experiences, or is that just a brain chemical thing and it's not really, a spiritual event? So many questions, so many ideas that come at you. And I think so many of us, we get such a sick taste in our mouth. Like this is so nasty that I don't want to hear any of it. I just want to start breathing, and I want to think through it on my terms, on my timeline, very slowly when I'm ready. And I don't even necessarily want too much input, or if I get input, I want it to be input that I completely voluntarily reached out for and grabbed, as opposed to someone shoved it down my throat or tried to. And I think that experience is pretty profound, and you get to a point where you just can't stomach anybody claiming that they have any kind of ultimate transcendent knowledge or transcendent answers. It's like, I don't think that there actually are transcendent answers, at least not that I can see so far, that we can really bank on. And I think it's possible that as we go on, not we, but as human race goes on, and eventually if they get better and better at science and better at space travel and so forth, that we will eventually have some really cool answers that people like you and I in this generation would have blown our minds to think about. But even as we progress, I don't see any evidence that we're going to get to a point where we figure out truly where all this came from, and the answer to the big question of, like, why is there something rather than nothing? And the question of, is there an unmoved mover? What happened before the Big Bang, and what happened before, if there was another, if the universe has been expanding and contracting, like, well, what happened to eventually start it, if you could frame it that way? And all these questions, you're just like, I keep on hearing people say, you have to have the answers, you have to have some, you can't just believe in nothing. And it's like, yes, I can. I can, and I don't need to have anybody who can kind of get into my inner sanctum of my
And I want to interrupt you before you
go for it.
Too far down, because you said they said you can't believe in nothing. And I think there's a slight little phraseology adjustment where you can't not believe in anything. And the difference between like passively believing and actively believing something, the passive active atheism, or I do believe there is no God and I lack a belief, I don't believe in a God. It's one of those things, it's kind of like, it's projectionism. They're projecting, and that's kind of where they're tipping their hand, and they're going, well, okay, even though we've been calling belief knowledge all this time, we're sort of admitting that it's a belief because we're projecting. You can't not believe something, because the necessity of having the belief is what this is, your salvation. And you go like, why do we have to come up with an answer? Well, we're taught if you don't come up with an answer, you're damned. Like, having an answer is the thing that saves you. And believing that your answer is right. It's not just believing something, it's believing the right thing. So, the Mormons and the Jews and the Muslims and the Hindus, they're all trying to get saved for something, and they're trying to come up with an answer. It's like, why? Well, this comes back, I guess, to sort of the character of God. Why would it be necessary to believe a thing that you can't prove? Why do you have to believe a thing? And even if why can't I just not have a belief? You have to believe. You can't believe nothing. Yeah, but can I not just not believe anything? Like, can I? So, like, challenging on what in your mind, what is the importance of belief itself? And I found that to be sort of when you're coming from an entirely different, like, if you've got a problem with their belief system in particular, and it's a sore point where you guys are going to have an argument or a contentious discussion over the tenets of the specifics, instead of debating that, debating belief as a concept is more a way of establishing common ground. I found you make more inroads. You kind of earn the right to be heard later on down the road, where you want to talk about things that are more prone to raising defense mechanisms. but just what in your experience, like, why do you see belief as a thing? Because I'd like to do is eliminate the need for belief as much as possible. Because they're like, well, you have to believe stuff. I go, well, it's not like have to, like I must, but like have to as it's unavoidable. Like if I get on a plane, I believe that it's going to land on a runway and not on a mountain. That's kind of faith based on a track record of a thing working the same way. I don't think it's kind of the same as a blind faith. It's an evidentiary faith. Um, but why do you find it necessary to make belief a thing? If we both agree that a belief is essentially a conclusion that you've reached without any that's on the lower end of the certainty spectrum, where you're absolutely certain and you have no idea. Belief is down towards we have no idea, which is why you have to believe it. Why do you think it's important to reach conclusions that you can't verify? And that will often get the wheels turning. Well, I haven't really thought about it that way. Why do I think that's important to reach conclusions about? I mean, because nobody feels compelled really to say where they stand on vampires or the Loch Ness monster. We're fine. Like we don't tell, well, you need to make up your mind. But in this one little particular sphere, the religious sphere, we go, you must conclude something. And you go, why? Let's like where does that come from a place of? I think it's interesting because it comes from a different place. It's a thing it's not a normal question, so people don't have practiced responses. So you don't get you don't get 100 people from the same group spitting back the same answer. You actually get 100 different responses because people are thinking about it.
Yeah. It's fascinating how so much of this is framed like a test, like Job is being tested. Will you let me take away all your kids, all your stuff, even, hurt your body and you'll still praise me? And it seems like a lot of this is phrased like God is saying, even though there's no really good evidence for this story, for the Bible story of Yahweh and Jesus, will you still believe it? That this test is actually, even though it seems nonsensical, it's actually the most important and profound test of your life. Will you believe that evidence is what we're going to base the entirety of your eternal life on? And I think, again, when you're a Christian, of course, you're going to praise God for it. This is God's way of sorting the sheep from the goats or whatever, as they say. But you realize this is the bizarrest concept, that one of the bizarrest concepts that's woven into it is God is basically testing everybody, and he's not acknowledging, if you have been real, he's not acknowledging that there are so many reasons to walk away from this religion, and he's not addressing the concerns. And so he's basically saying, if you have been real, he's saying, I understand not only that there's no evidence for this worldview to be real, but there's actually a lot of concerns, like you brought up the discrepancies and contradicting passages. There's a lot of issues with it. And so he's not only not giving the evidence for his existence, directly, but he's also not addressing the fact that this story just sounds so man-made. And it's like, I think a lot about people's deconversion stories. And I think, what you've said about yours so far and what I would say about mine, God had plenty of time to come in and intervene. If he could have said, you know what, Shane, I saw you starting to drift, and I knew that I wanted you as my child. I wanted you in heaven. And when you started drifting, you were asking some really good questions, at least, in your frail human mind. But I knew that they meant a lot to you. And so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to show up big and give you answers and show myself so vividly that there's no way that you can deny I am giving you solid answers and I'm clearly working in your life. There's no doubt about it. And instead, for so many of us, we would just say it was just crickets. It was just silence. And it's like, God, where are you? Not just in the painful parts of life, but just where are you at all? And he never shows up. Never shows up in the still small voice stuff. He never shows up in the big, healing kids of cancer. He never shows up when you've got discrepancy questions. And it's like, God, you not only didn't show up, you also foresaw in your wisdom that these issues would come up and would eventually deconvert people. And yet you didn't eliminate them in the first place. Like, why not make one gospel that just blends and merges. Why not? Why
Oh, I got
four?
a new theory. I got a
Yeah,
brand new theory that,
go for it.
oh, this just came to me. You sparked something, Tim. So what if we are being tested, but the only
Pretty
really
screwed right now.
accurate thing in the Bible was that we are made in the image of God, and it's our thinking ability that is, it's not the physical, God doesn't have a physical form. That thinking ability is the image of God that we are made in. And you know how, the fundamentalists say dinosaur bones are a test. They were placed there by Satan to test our faith. What if the Christian view of the Bible and the religion was actually that was the test? Can we use our minds to break free of it? Kind of like the way we were given a word problem. All right, a train leaves Philadelphia headed west with 13 barrels of coconuts. If the coconuts are $12 a pound and it passes a train going north from Chicago, then how much change will John have if he sells the coconuts? And you got to figure all this stuff out. If you got to use your brain to figure out all the way, if the contradictions are there, and I didn't feel this thing at the preacher, and then we go, all right, I solved the equation. The equation is all this was fake. It's not real. Then God goes, well done, my good and faithful servant. You get in, come get your eternal reward. Now you got past you passed the test. What if that's the test? Instead of believing the things there's no evidence for, it's solving the equation that the evidence is there. Those are the variables you got to plug in. And so, ooh, I like that.
Hmm. I think too, just expanding that slightly. This is a different direction, but just a little bit of a side application. I think too a lot about how if God were real and this salvation story were real, it would make him really a jerk for ignoring the not just the questions that people have, but also the pain that people have. Like, for example, your story, my story, there we align enough in our journeys that we could sum it up and say we tried really hard to believe and we tried to stay in our faith, but there were splinters in our minds that we could not escape. We had to deal with them. And eventually they took us out. And it's like, okay, so God's going to send us to hell. And then I think of a different scenario where someone's going to be in hell. Say a girl that got assaulted and the assault made her think God couldn't protect me. God let me go through some horrible experience. And in her bitterness against God, she ends up deserting God and leaving the faith. And then the guy that assaulted her, who did this horrible thing, he's on death row, and at the last minute he prays a real prayer. God, I believe in Jesus as my Lord and Savior. Amen. Just like the thief on the cross, you'll be with me today in paradise.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the end of the day, this equation, you have people like us who tried so hard, who loved Jesus for decades. We end up in hell. The girl that tried so hard to believe in Jesus, but she just got so wounded, she could not believe in a God who could not give her basic safety. And she got wounded and bitter, according to the Christians, and she escaped and she left. And the only guy that ends up getting in heaven is the jerk that arguably shouldn't be there, obviously, apart from, of course, the grace of God, as they would say. But he ends up leaving a whole bunch of really good people, really honest people that are honest with the pain and honest with the questions. He leaves us in the lurch, never does anything to prevent the situation in the first place, never gives you good answers or a resolution. And he ends up saving the person that didn't give a rat's ass about God the whole time. It's quite an interesting dynamic, but I feel like I do want to say, if you want to say something about that, I'll give you the chance. Saying I probably should give you a quick chance too before we wrap up to talk about your book. So if you want to respond to what I just said, feel free. And then I did want to ask you if you could just segue us into a little introduction to what your books are about, if we pick those up.
I will let your thought stand on its own because it is a great thought exercise for people to just kind of marinate on. So I won't screw up the sauce by adding some extra ingredients.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, your two books again, Conspiracy Christianity, and there's a long subtitle there that I read earlier, and The Trumpland Diary, a journal of bigly proportions. What are those two books about, and what can people expect if they go pick them up?
So as I mentioned, I worked for, maybe I didn't mention it while we were doing recording. I worked for Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago when I was in college back in 1999, I think was the year. So it was quite a while back.
So you actually saw him and work near him?
Yeah, so I'm interactive with him. I've got
Wow.
several anecdotes in the book about when he gets involved, not knowing what's going on, and does the Donald thing, just turning a bad situation into something infinitely worse. Um, what that book, and it's a really thick one. It was 6 years of social media posts, and I said, I didn't. My social media feed, and I got on in like 2008 or nine. It was like Chuck Norris memes and cat videos and people are awesome videos, and I I stayed away from anything controversial. I didn't post politics or religion or anything like that. And when he started running, at first I thought, okay, well, this is, he ran before. He's ran before a couple times. A lot of people don't remember that he ran twice. And one time was to promote the republication of the Art of the Deal. And the second time he was opening a condo and he was trying to like draw up attention for the units. And so that was his way of, free marketing was I'll throw my hat in the presidential ring. So when he did this again, I was like, okay, well, he's trying to negotiate the apprentice contract with NBC. And so he's trying to, I figured that's, he's trying to milk a couple $100 million more out of them. And then when he started picking up steam, I was like, oh, no, guys, you don't want a Trump presidency. And it started being, it was kind of like the Daily Show, Jon Stewart stuff, Trevor Noah, John Oliver, big fan of. So just like daily humorous thoughts on whatever inane, asinine thing he did that day. So just sort of satirical, sarcastic commentary. And it was, 6 years, like the year he announced he was running until about a month after the January 6th, 2021, I guess, insurrection. It was basically a daily public journal of that period of time. Lots of memes, lots of stand-up material, just kind of irreverent observations, commentary on it. But there was one section of it that became the next book, the Christianity, Conspiracy Christianity. And at the time, it was like 5 reasons, because Q was becoming more prevalent back in like 2016, 2017. And I don't know, it was probably around 2018 or something. I'd written like, here's 5 things that, us evangelicals do that aid to this. And then about this time last year, Derek Bennett had asked me if I would do a presentation at the annual GCRR atheism conference. And I said, I don't have, like, I know what your channel's all about, and you've got mountains of material to draw from. He's the mythicist background and all that. I said, I've got lots of thoughts, but I don't have material, certainly not enough to put together in a month, I don't think. And he goes, well, there were some things in the Trump book. And I said, well, there's the Christianity thing. I could expound on that. And so I did. It went from 5 to 7, and I fleshed it out a little bit. And after doing that presentation, Dr. Richard Carrier asked me if I would publish it. And so I kind of assembled it into a book form, because most of the content was there. I just had to cohesively join the chapter. So it wasn't very much work to get from the presentation to the book. And my mom, if this was about Christian stuff instead of anti-Christian stuff, every step in the way was a divine appointment. Tim, don't you see that? Don't you see how that initial path, right, of getting I was placed in Trump's path so that I could write the Trump book. And then Derek Bennett was placed in my path so he could ask me to do the atheism presentation. And then Dr. Carrier asked me to write. So it was just divine appointment after, except it's all in the name of atheism. That math doesn't work out. Maybe we should not call all of these happenstance coincidences divine appointments. But anyways, that's how the two
satanic appointments.
What's that?
Satanic appointments.
Yeah. That's how the 2 books came about. So the one, it was just what is happening culturally with Trump at the helm, and then what can I tell non-Christians, having grown up in the church? How are we thought trained to embrace these dangerous conspiracy theories with the hope that it cultivates understanding? And my goal was not give you some more ridicule fodder, but hopefully if we can create some empathy and some understanding, we can tamp down the temperature, the political temperature a little bit.
Yeah, I love it. That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I feel like we just touched the tip of the iceberg, and I was thinking, I would love to do a follow up with you, but I'd love to do a tag team where it's with Derek Bennett too, because number one, it'll be a lot more entertaining because of his humor and the way you all interact, and I'll add a few jokes here or there that'll be nowhere near his level. But I was going to say maybe we could dive into some of these topics more deeply, and I'd love to maybe I'll pick up a copy of the book, at least the not the Trump one, but the Conspiracy Christianity book. I'll pick up a copy and read through it and take some good notes and maybe get some questions together and do a follow up with Derek Bennett and kind of roundtable it from there. But I really appreciate you sharing your story today. And obviously, the big picture is I'm so glad you escaped and got out of it. I'm so glad that you're able to figure out that it was mythology and reclaim your identity. Again, going back to your story there, thank you so much for sharing your story about your upbringing and your deconversion. I'm so glad you escaped, and I just appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate your book, and especially the idea of, helping people to think through with your second book. How do we have better thoughts, and to help Christians, hopefully, at least some of them, to say, like, will you at least consider taking a second look at not just what you believe, but why do you believe it? How did you arrive at that conclusion? Great stuff. I think a lot about, street epistemology, those kind of questions. We all need that. We all need to be thinking better thoughts, and not just thinking better thoughts, but setting up a better structure for how to think better thoughts. So thank you so much. I'll just wrap up then by saying we've been speaking with Shane Almgren. Shane, thank you so much. Great to get to know you, and I look forward to doing it again shortly.
All right, Tim. Thanks so much. It was great to talk with you. Take care.
Likewise. Thank you.